so that folks can see what's going on. Sesame stream. There we go. All right. Howdy, everyone. So, finishing up the second half of today's lecture, we are now done with talking about Russia, which is what we focused on this morning. And now we're looking at another aspect of the unit that we're in right now, the age of mass politic, and we're looking at imperialism. Now, when we think about that word imperialism, you might think, I don't know if you guys know anything about Star Wars, but you might think about like the Imperial Stormtroopers or something like that. Anytime we use the word imperial, it really is just relating to the word empire, okay? So whenever you hear imperial, just think empire, right? You guys know, or should know already, that for going all the way back really to Columbus, okay, when Columbus first set sail across the ocean in 1492, that European kingdoms started to build colonial empires across the globe, right? So Columbus and the Spanish established imperial control in the New World, Central and South America, as did the Portuguese. The English, Dutch, French settled in North America, established colonies there. Also, obviously, the English established colonies elsewhere in India and in Egypt and various other locations throughout the planet, Australia, you name it. The Dutch do the same, and the French do the same. So we are familiar with the concept of colonization, which is where these European empires are coming over and building colonies for the purposes of serving the home state, the home nation, right? Bringing raw materials from these distant places back to Europe to be processed into whatever. After industrialization, we enter into a new phase of imperialism, which is why this PowerPoint here is called the new imperialism, because old imperialism refers to kind of like the Spanish colonists, the Portuguese colonists, the English colonists who set up these colonies back in the 15, 16, 1700s. The new imperialism relates more directly to the late 19th century, the unit that we're in, age of mass politics. This new form of imperialism comes about, and I mentioned this in another lecture earlier this week, as a result essentially of steamships. So steamships allowed Europeans to travel against the flow of a river and enter into new regions that previously geographically were impossible to get to. And so when we talk about this new form of imperialism, we have to understand that it's accompanied by advances of the Industrial Revolution that did not exist prior to the 19th century. This includes not only steamships, but also new advancements in weapons, and also manufactured goods made from machines, from factories in, let's say, Britain, for example, that they bring with them to these places to sell to the people that live in these new regions that they are conquering, colonizing. In particular, another difference between the old imperialism and the new imperialism is where they are colonizing. So when we think old imperialism, really we're more focused on like the New World, North, Central, South America. When we think new imperialism, we're focused more on Africa, Southeast Asia, China to an extent, even though China never becomes a formal colony, the British and various other European nations go into China and exert dominance in the eastern coastal regions of China, taking over their ports in many cases, and dominating Chinese foreign trade. The effects of the new imperialism last well into the 20th century, and really now even into the 21st century. We are still seeing places on the globe who are reeling, recovering from the effects of European nations going in and establishing colonies and dominating these places for a long time. One of the things it's a double-edged sword, imperialism. Now, I'm by no means an expert in the history of India, but I know enough about British history to be able to speak a little bit about it. In the case of India, so the British go to India really a long time before the age of the new imperialism. They had been in India going all the way back to the 1700s. However, India becomes much more important to Britain as a colony after the American Revolution. When America breaks away from British control in 1776 with Declaration of Independence and the American War for Independence, when they break away, England focuses much more of their efforts on colonizing India, and which they had gained a substantial amount of territory from France in the 7 Years' War in 1754. And so as time went on, and England being the first nation in the world to industrialize, India indirectly benefited to an extent from Britain's colonization. However, like I say, it's a double-edged sword. There were also a lot of not so good things that came about as a result of India being colonized. And but India was absolutely vital to the British Empire. I can't understate that enough. The geographic location of India was so different from Britain, and all of the kinds of raw materials and so on that the British wanted to obtain for the purposes of industrialization. This includes things like rubber, it includes cotton, it includes all sorts of different kinds of things. But they bring all of this stuff from, tea would be another one, they bring all of this stuff back from India to Britain, manufactured into finished goods, and then they take the finished goods, transfer those back to India and sell the finished goods. So what ends up happening in this scenario is that on one hand, the English are saving money by using Indian labor, which they pay far less than British labor back home in Britain. So they save money on that end. They take the raw materials for very, very cheap. They bring them back to Britain. They manufacture them into finished goods, and then they make money on the back end of it when they then sell those finished goods back to the Indian people who live there. Okay, and this ultimately makes Britain extraordinarily wealthy, however, very much at the expense of the population of India. On the other side of that, there were some good things that came about as a result. Healthcare improved significantly in India as a result of advances in medication that were coming out from England during the 1800s. Also, railroads. To this day, even in India, there are a number of railroads that were built a very long time ago that are still used in India as a result of the British bringing railroad technology and builders over there, and these kinds of things. However, the big problem is this. When Britain, let's say, has a colony, and the colony is behaving in other words, not disrupting British commercial activity. 2, productive, meaning that they are still able to produce the kinds of things that Britain wants to take. Those kinds of qualities make it so that the colony remains in good favor, good standing with Britain. When the colony stops being productive, or stops behaving, if you will, according to Britain's rules, Britain has a way of kind of like hightailing it out of there and saying, okay, well, here's a textbook on democracy. Here's how we recommend you set your stuff up. Good luck. See you later. Have fun with being independent now. And this leads, of course, to a lot of problems. And not just in India, but in many, many places in Africa and across the globe. So the problem mainly that you have with colonization in this new period of imperialism that we're going to find as we enter into the 20th century, and these nations that had been colonies start gaining their independence, it's very similar to the kind of toxic relationship formed between like a drug dealer and an addict. Okay, the relationship is fine for a while, seemingly, and then either the drug dealer goes to jail and the addict is left without a drug dealer, or they are so hopelessly addicted to whatever they're addicted to that they can't seemingly function on their own. And what ends up happening is that these nations become very dependent on Britain, their military, their goods, and so on. And they don't have the infrastructure necessary to sustain the same level of production and so on that they had when they had the assistance of the British, who had essentially taken them over. So when these colonial empires, the French, the British, and others, end up leaving these places a lot of times are left kind of floundering and trying to pick up the pieces and figure out how to establish a functional sovereign state. It goes without saying that we've seen stories in the news about widespread corruption in India. We've seen stories in the news about political wars in many places throughout Africa, but in particular Nigeria, which was a British colony, and other ones as well, the Congo, which was a Dutch colony, and so on. And there is a lot of tension and chaos when these European nations ultimately kind of wash their hands of the colonial situation and decide not to have colonies anymore. So that doesn't come really until after World War II, though, which means that for a good 50, 70 years, sometimes more, these nations had become very used to British dominance. And I'm using the British in particular because they had the most vast colonial empire, but it wasn't just the British. So what is imperialism as defined by essentially the textbook for historical purposes? It's basically the control of one people by another. And we need to keep in mind that imperialism isn't just economic. It could be political, it could be cultural, or it could be economic, or a mix of the three. It can be ideological in the sense that Europeans at this time very much viewed themselves as superior to other races, other ethnic groups across the planet. Between 1880 and 1914, European nations scrambled for political as well as economic control over foreign nations. This scramble led to new tensions among the European nations themselves because each of them was beginning to compete for gaining as many colonies in these previously untouched regions of the globe to expand their own economic enterprises back in their home countries, and also with non-European powers as well. So the old imperialism that I was talking about before occurred largely between the 16th and the 18th centuries. European powers did not usually acquire territory in Africa and Asia, but instead built a series of trading stations or trading outposts in these regions. And another thing to keep in mind about imperialism is that really there's different kinds of imperialism outside of political, economic, and social. Some imperialism is much more direct control. Other imperialism is more indirect control. And we'll talk about the differences between those today. But the New World, in terms of the old imperialism, the New World was the exception where in the New World, thanks to, and we talked about this at the start of the school year, thanks to disease outbreaks, in particular smallpox, but other ones too, ravaging the Native American populations here in the United States, as well as in Central and South America, it made it much easier for the Europeans to enter into, take over those lands and conquer them and establish colonies where they took the land, established their own self-government on those lands, and wiped clean the entire population of those people who had previously been living on those lands, either by way of disease or through warfare. But Spain's encomienda system, we talked about that, was exploiting the use of native indigenous peoples for their labor. It was essentially slavery, and it was extremely brutal. And then the establishment of colonies in Central and South America by the Spanish and the Portuguese in Brazil. The greatest migration in history took place when more than 60 million people left Europe between 1815 and 1932. During that century, there's this huge exodus of Europeans from different places. At some points it was Irish folks because of the Irish potato famine that happened in the 1830s. In other cases it was Germans. In other cases it was Italians and sometimes Jews and so on who came over from Eastern Europe and Russia. Nonetheless, in that century, a little more than a century, 60 million people left Europe and settled in other places. How come they did this? Well, the population of Europe had continued to grow dramatically after industrialization. So between 1800 and 1900, the population is just absolutely taking off. And this population growth was really very much the impetus or the cause behind much of this emigration out of Europe. Migration patterns varied from country to country, reflecting the different social and economic conditions there. Some people traveled farther, some people traveled less far. When we talk about migration, remember that it could be international migration, but typically most migration is actually quite local. People will leave a farm or a rural area and migrate to the nearest city to seek out work. Most people can't really afford really long distance migration because it's expensive to secure travel to distant regions, especially in this time. Other motives, though, outside of the population growth for this new era of imperialism was the search for new markets, meaning indigenous folks to sell finished products, industrial goods to, and also new materials. You can see here on the left side of this slide a picture of an ivory tusk, as well as picture of diamonds, or at least fake diamonds. I don't know if those are real diamonds or not, but these would have been some of the kinds of precious materials that, in particular, the British, but also others, were trying to obtain in these other regions. There are no elephants in England, and there are no diamond mines in England. And so you have to go elsewhere to find these kinds of rare goods. Now, if you didn't know this, ivory comes from elephant tusks, which means that to secure ivory, you essentially have to kill elephants, which is why today you can't buy ivory stuff, because in order to purchase something that's made of ivory, an elephant died for that, right? So it's illegal to purchase ivory goods these days. There's probably exceptions to that. Like, for example, back in the olden days, pianos, the keys for pianos, the white keys of pianos, were typically made out of ivory. And so if you bought like an old piano from the late early 1900s with ivory keys, you know, that's probably perfectly fine. But if you went to Walmart and bought an ivory comb, first of all, you wouldn't find one, but secondly, it would be highly illegal. So, anyway, I kind of went on a tangent there. But the point being that ivory is one of the things that they're trying to secure. You also see during this time, between the European nations and other nations across the globe, that there you have increased tension between what we'll call the haves and the have-nots. British folks have industrialized, they have an advanced economy, they've got a lot of money, they've got a lot of colonies, and they would be considered haves. Have-nots, okay, might be considered like the Germans and the Italians. Why? Because unlike Britain, which had established this vast trading network with a bunch of colonies going all the way back to the late 1500s, early 1600s, Germany really didn't have any colonies, nor did Russia, nor did Italy. They just weren't players in the colonization game in the old imperialism. So the European nations themselves start bickering with one another, fighting with one another over the unfairness of Britain having so many colonies and Germany having none, or France having so many colonies and Italy having none. So the British were concerned by French and German land grabs in the 1880s. And they were worried that they might seal off their empires with high tariffs and restrictions if the Germans were able to acquire a whole bunch of land in these foreign territories. And that would obviously prevent future economic opportunities to be lost by Britain. So they end up having some quarrels over this. We'll talk about how those are resolved in a little bit. Another major motivation for colonizing came more from an ideological or cultural aspect. Now, the trend in Europe throughout the 17 and 1800s is that we are seeing religion become more under scrutiny, or people are more skeptical of religion and the role that established churches play and stuff like that. We would generally say that after the Enlightenment, Europe has trended towards secularism, okay, non-religious beliefs. However, that there is still a good number of people who are quite religious in Europe. And as a result of both religious beliefs but also cultural beliefs, one of the major motivations for Europeans to go over and start colonizing some of these places was missionary work. The idea that here you have Europe, which is Christian, which is largely white, very patriarchal, male-dominated, and these ideas for centuries had defined the European character. And seemingly to the Europeans, these principles, patriarchy, Christianity, whiteness, to them were all connected and evidence of why Europe was so successful. Now, I'm not saying that that's a correct statement at all, but what I'm saying is that they're using these principles to justify European greatness, okay? European, like the exceptional character of Europeans being largely male-dominated, largely white, and largely Christian, okay? So they have a prerogative to take these cultural values and spread them to other places, okay? What makes this a tricky conversation is that, going back to what I was telling you before about what happens when these colonies are left to fend for themselves, being bad, largely, the tricky part of the conversation is that hindsight is always 20/20. We can look back at a situation, we can look back at something and say, that was a mistake, or, that was lucky, or whatever else. Easier to do, though, with time passing, because you can look back on it and have a better perspective of what went on and so on. When you're in it, as these guys were at the time, things are less clear. And we have to understand the motivations of these people based on their time, not based on our understanding of their time. The two are different. Does that make sense to you guys at all? Okay? In other words, when we're measuring something, we need to measure it in the context that it occurred, not take our measuring sticks from the 21st century and measure it based on that. We know it turned bad. They didn't know it was going to turn bad because they didn't have a crystal ball to tell the future yet. So what's hard about it is that guys like this guy here, okay, Dr. David Livingstone. Dr. David Livingstone would be a guy in history that would be pretty easy to demonize because he was extremely devoted to this idea of white man's burden. And this connects to what I was telling you about with Christianity, patriarchy, and whiteness. Idea being that Europeans, like Dr. David Livingstone, viewed themselves as, if you will, the fathers of the world. That is, that there were other regions on the planet who had not been through industrialization, who had not had any exposure to Christianity, who had not this, that, the other, experienced the benefits of the kinds of lives that people in Europe were able to live. He was very committed to the idea of bringing what he perceived as the greatness of European civilization and spreading that to other places. In this sense, he could be called a humanitarian because he's trying to take what he believed at that time were the best qualities of Europe and bring them to other places to help them improve. Now, of course, the other side of that conversation is that these people never asked for the Europeans to come over and take them over and force their value systems on them. And so even though he believed that he was doing good work, the reality of the situation, of course, is that it ultimately led to a whole lot of problems for the next century or more. The other side of the work that he's doing is that, again, taking it in the context of his time, you guys have to understand, this is in the late 1800s, okay? If you come down with an infection today, let's say you get whatever, strep throat, bacterial infection. You go to the doctor, you can be seen usually the same or next day. You go to urgent care, the doctor does a throat culture. They say, oh, yep, you have strep throat. Here's a prescription for antibiotics. You go and pick them up, and boom, you're cured, okay, within the next 2 weeks. They didn't have antibiotics at this time. Antibiotics don't get invented until 1928, okay? I want you to consider that for a second and realize that these guys here who are going over, and I'm not apologizing or being what do they call it? Apologetic or I'm not condoning their actions. What I'm trying to say is that their actions were extremely risky that could have resulted in their death. They're going into the tropics in Africa. Malaria could have killed you inside of a week of arriving. They didn't have, modern day vaccines or anything like that to prevent them from getting all sorts of different kinds of illnesses, whether it be yellow fever or West Nile virus or you name it. This was deadly work. And two, you never knew who you were going to run into. People could have killed you going over. You don't know who you're going to run into. And so this kind of work, it took a whole lot of courage to go over there and do this. It was very, in their view, very self-sacrificial because it's like, I don't know if I'm going to survive this or not, but I believe in it so much that I'm going to go over there and try and spread the graces of European society. There's a famous story about Dr. Livingstone where nobody had heard from him in years. Many people presumed he was dead, okay? He ended up being in the middle of Africa, continental Africa, and he was really the first white man to go over and do humanitarian religious work in Central and South Africa, and nobody had heard from him in a long time. They end up hiring this guy by the name of H.M. Stanley to go find him, to see if they can find Dr. Livingstone. H.M. Stanley goes over to Africa. He goes on this huge exploration, and he is using every single clue at his disposal to try to track down Dr. Livingstone. When I was a kid, I used to watch Sesame Street. Okay, you guys may have heard of Sesame Street before. It's on PBS. There was a Burton Ernie sketch on Sesame Street, where Ernie, Sesame Street, they make it for kids, so they're trying to teach kids about different types of jobs, I think it was. Ernie's going through the jungle, and he runs into like a taxi driver, and he's like, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" And the guy's like, "No, I'm a cab driver." And then he sees like a guy driving a fire truck, and he's like, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" He's like, "No, I'm a firefighter." And then he comes across a guy dressed in like a doctor outfit, and he's like, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" And he's like, "Yes, you found me. I'm Dr. Livingston." And that's a play on this real historical story that happened where H.M. Stanley went into the jungle to find Dr. Livingston, and lo and behold, he does find him. So he walks up to him, and he says, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" And he says, "Yes." And so he found Livingston, whom many Westerners thought to be dead, and his newspaper reports created European interest in Africa after talking about the kinds of things that he saw while he was there. H.M. Stanley sought aid of the King of Belgium later to dominate the Congo region. This is where we start to get into the bad side of things. In particular, the Belgians' treatment of the Congolese people. Many people know the story of, let's say, for example, the Holocaust, where 11 or more million people lost their lives in the middle of World War II as a result of basically the mechanization of death of Jewish folks and others during the Holocaust. There's a certain coldness and inhumane character to the Holocaust, which makes it a notorious historical event. Most people, though, don't know that the Belgians' treatment of the Congolese resulted in the deaths of 10 million Congolese people, right? Pretty much same number of people that were killed in the Holocaust, maybe a little less. And it's all as a result of the absolutely just devastatingly terrible treatment that the Belgians used against the Congolese people in terms of forced labor, in terms of disease, and so on and so forth, sometimes just straight up killing them. So the King of Belgium, he basically treated Congo as his own personal backyard. I don't know if you've ever seen a map of Africa, but the Democratic Republic of the Congo is right in central South Africa. It's huge. It's like 80 times the size of Belgium. And the King of Belgium was essentially treating it as his own backyard. He had total control over everything that happened there, and the treatment of the Congolese people got so bad, news stories started hitting Europe, including places like Belgium, about the treatment of it, and they basically stripped Congo away from him because it was so inhumane. So these kinds of things happen during the age of imperialism, which make it a sensitive topic to talk about. New military and naval bases were also created there around Africa to protect their interests. So what we're really referring to here is these two ideologies of nationalism, pride in one's nation, and social Darwinism. When we talk about white man's burden, this is a function of social Darwinism, because they are basically saying it is the responsibility of the white European male to take care of these other distant regions because they won't be able to do it on their own. The same way that it's a father's responsibility to take care of his family because they won't be able to take care of themselves on their own. Very patriarchal. Also very racist, okay? So let's not forget that side of it. It's related to the concept of social Darwinism, though, because many people, so you guys probably know of Charles Darwin, right? Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of the Species in the 1830s, 1840s. After his ship, HMS Beagle, had traveled around and gone to places like the Galapagos Islands and so on, and found all these different species of animals, birds, lizards, you name it, and basically said, these animals have developed certain biological features that have helped them adapt to the environmental conditions that they live in. The other side of nature is that it's brutal. The animals that are the strongest, the fastest, the best adapted through genetic mutations are the ones that survive. The animals that are slower, weaker, less well adapted are the ones that get conquered or eaten in the jungle, in the wild, okay? Later, these ideas started being adapted to humans. This is where we get the idea of social Darwinism, which is not true Darwinism, to be clear, okay? Social Darwinism is kind of a tangent offshoot of Darwin's ideas. So I feel ashamed to even attach Darwin's name to it, but that's what it's known as, so there's really no avoiding it. Charles Darwin didn't believe in social Darwinism, at least not as far as I know. But anyhow, the point being that social Darwinism is this idea that humans are just animals like the rest of the creatures on the planet, and that means that humans, very similar to animals, are intended to be cruel. That weaker humans are destined to be conquered, and stronger humans are destined to thrive. And of course, when we talk about weaker versus stronger humans, immediately there's no denying the concept of race that goes into that, where who's perceived as the strongest humans on the planet at the time, but for European males, and then who are perceived as the weakest, anyone who's not a white European male, okay? And this means that, once again, a self kind of justifying claim of, well, it's going to happen anyway, so because Europeans are already the most advanced on the planet, it's just destined to be that way because that's how social Darwinism works, that's how Darwin taught us evolution works or whatever. And so these Europeans don't feel much shame about going over and conquering these other people because they believe in this idea of social Darwinism where the weak are destined to be conquered and killed. And so these ideas are all interconnected with one another. White man's burden, social Darwinism, patriarchy, all of that stuff, okay? White man's burden comes from, actually, a poem. There was a famous poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling. Now, have you guys ever heard of Rudyard Kipling? Heard the name before. The reason you may have heard the name before is because Rudyard Kipling wrote another famous story that I bet you have heard of. You ever heard of the Jungle Book? The Jungle Book? Okay. Baloo, Bagheera, all those, Shere Khan, all those guys, okay? By the way, interesting story about the Jungle Book while I'm on the topic, just because I'm thinking about it. You know the Disney version of the Jungle Book, Mowgli goes back and ends up living with the humans, right? Yeah. Not to spoil it for you, in the actual original book, The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, when Mowgli returns back to the villagers of humans, they reject him because he was raised in the wild. So he goes back to the jungle, he gathers up all of his jungle friends, and they go back to the village and they slaughter every last one of them. Yeah, it's a much darker end to the book than the Disney movie would have you believe. That's probably why they didn't put that in there. Yeah, no one would have left the theater feeling good about the ending of that movie. Yeah, exactly, right? So, but anyhow, Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem called White Man's Burden, and it says, I think I had a quote, I thought I had a quote on here, but let's just sum it up here. It's a racist, patronizing account that preached the superior Westerners had an obligation to bring their culture to uncivilized peoples in other parts of the world. And again, this is a poem by Rudyard Kipling that became very well known at this time. Germany and Russia in particular used imperialistic drives to divert popular attention from the class struggle at home and create this false sense of national unity, despite the fact that at home there were vast social differences between the wealthy and the working class, both in Russia and in Germany. So to divert those unequal, unfavorable conditions, to divert people's attention away from them, they use nationalism to draw people together and make them feel like, well, whether I'm rich or poor, at the end of the day, I'm whatever, German, Russian, American, you name it. And those nationalistic ideas get used to smooth over what would otherwise be perceived as very unfair grievances amongst the population. And one way, so to finish that point, one way to drive that nationalistic point home is to say, well, at the end of the day, everybody wants Germany to go and colonize other places. So if you can get people to focus on, Germany grabbing more land in Africa and get people to stop focusing on the unfairness of the economic situation in Germany, it makes it easier for them to continue to subjugate that portion of the population. All right. British Egypt. This was a model for new imperialism. Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, modernized and turned Egypt into a virtually independent state by 1849. The protectorate was supposed to be temporary, a British protectorate, making Egypt a protectorate of Britain, and it wound up lasting until 1956. So Egypt really doesn't become completely sovereign until the 1950s, which is, for the record, 4 years after my parents were born. 1875, Britain bought a significant portion of shares for the Suez Canal and began managing it. Previously, you might remember that the Suez Canal was actually built by the French. By the way, that's what's on here, right here. This line that connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. This is the Suez Canal. And the British were using the Suez Canal. In fact, they even nicknamed it the lifeline of the empire, meaning it was the fastest route to get from Britain through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean and get to India. That was the fastest route. Rather than having to sail all the way down across the southern tip of Africa and then all the way back up to India again, they took this shortcut through the Suez, and they ended up buying a bunch of shares of it. Of course, the Suez Canal ended up being a key motive in why Britain wanted to continue occupying Egypt, because that's exactly where the Suez Canal runs through, is Egypt, so they didn't want to lose control of that. I mentioned this already, but I'll just say it again. The Belgian Congo, Leopold II of Belgium, don't get that confused with another Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, who was from the Habsburgs hundreds of years ago, different Leopold, but this Leopold was Leopold II of Belgium. He sent H.M. Stanley down to the Congo to start establishing trading stations and signing treaties with people, even though these treaties really weren't going to be abided by, with various African chiefs in local tribes, and began immediately claiming the lands of the Congo for Belgium. Leopold's incursion into the Congo basin raised the question of the political fate of much of sub-Saharan Africa, or what we will term Black Africa, because the northern part of Africa, Egypt, Libya, where else? Tunisia, Morocco, all of those areas of northern Africa are largely Muslim. Okay, so you have some darker skinned folks there, but generally speaking, they're mostly Muslim populations in those regions. The further south you go into Africa, you get more ethnic Africans who live further south. That too has created problems, because a lot of places, say for example Chad, in Chad there's a number of problems between ethnic black Africans and the ethnic Muslims who live in those regions and treat the African populations very, very badly. So there's this scramble for Africa. All these, it becomes like the hot, it's like the, oh man, I lost time. I ran out of time. But think of Africa as basically being the hottest commodity at the, just like the Bitcoin of the late 1800s, okay? Everybody wants a piece of Africa, all right? And so these European nations start scrambling to gobble up as much lands as they can. And ultimately, in order to avert having a war with each other, they end up having this conference to decide how are we going to carve up Africa and delegate pieces of Africa out to the various European states. All right, and we'll talk more about that probably on Friday. All righty? Very good. Thanks so much for listening. Hey, have a great day.